How do you feel when you switch to Geico and save on your car insurance? It's like going to work on one Thursday morning and thinking to yourself, just one more day until Friday. But then somebody in the elevator says, Happy Friday! Then you check your phone quickly and discover today is actually Friday. So yes, Happy Friday, random stranger in the elevator. Happy Friday indeed. Yep, switching and saving with Geico feels just like that. Get more with Geico.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to Tea Break Time Travel, where every month we look at a different archaeological object and take you on a journey into their past. Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Tea Break Time Travel. I am your host, Dr. Matilda Siebrecht, and today I am savouring a black vanilla chai tea, which I recently picked up on holiday because, you know, I don't have enough tea at home. And joining me on my tea break today is Dr. Alice Blackwell, Senior Curator of Medieval Archaeology and History at National Museum Scotland. So welcome, Alice. Thank you for joining me. And what are you drinking on your tea break today?
Thanks so much for having me. No, it's a pleasure to be here. I have got extremely boring, extremely standard English breakfast Yorkshire tea with some milk.
I mean, classic, I would say.
Classic. Okay, classic. Let's go classic. Let's go classic.
Yeah. Exactly. It doesn't have to be fancy. I must admit, if I have normal black tea, I have to have sugar in it. I'm one of those people that needs something a little sweet, but I fully respect the classics as well. Is that a standard for you to have just the classic English breakfast tea?
It is. It's a standard. I also like a wee Earl Grey from time to time. And I do like a chai sometimes in the afternoon. But fallback is just quite a strong sort of no sugar, just a bit of milk English breakfast. And we've got Yorkshire tea in the office, which is where I am today.
Also a classic. I'm curious because I never used to know the difference between English breakfast and Earl Grey. And now I do kind of know the difference. Do you drink milk with Earl Grey?
Well, I do, but it's a bit controversial. Some people don't. Okay. So Earl Grey has bergamot. It's flavoured with bergamot, which is quite a citrusy flavour. And so some people have it black with a little bit of lemon to complement that. And I like it black, but I also just like it as a kind of milky, lovely cup of tea. Bergamot's one of my favourite scents. So
it is a good one. It is a very good one. I know that Ash from Ashwood Candles uses that a lot in her archaeology related sense, and it's always divine.
It's yum. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know because I must admit I was at a conference recently and they didn't have English breakfast option. They only had Earl Grey as the black tea, and I automatically then put in some milk, and I don't know, I was tasting it and I was just like, it's not quite the same. I don't know.
It is not the same. It is a different thing. It's a lovely thing, but it's also acceptable to have it without milk, and then it's different again.
Okay. Oh, there you go. See, who knew? Who knew the politics of tea was so complicated?
No, it's all good in my
to each their own.
Yeah.
With milk or without. Well, thank you again for joining me on my tea break. And as I mentioned, you are curator of medieval archaeology and history. How did you first get into that topic? Was it always that particular period? Were you in a different form of archaeology and history at the beginning?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think my love for archaeology kind of stretches back to when I was a child, actually. With my parents, when it was somebody's birthday, you would get to choose what you would like to do for the day. And often my day trips revolved around visiting like prehistoric monuments and cafes for a cream tea. Oh. It's a standard combination. So we used to go and visit lots of places like that. And I loved that. I used to have a kind of secondhand copy of, I think, the Collins Guide to Archaeology in Britain, and I used to take that around with me and buy postcards and pop it in and stuff when I was quite wee. So yeah, I loved that. And then I did history at university and kind of found it a little bit boring. I know.
Any historians listening, it's fine. Don't worry.
It was in my defense. It was fairly modern history, and I don't know. It didn't light my fire. But then I did a special subject in Russian history through art, music, and literature, kind of, looking at it, but from kind of non-traditional historical sources. And that got me really interested. And then I realized that actually what I really wanted to do was archaeology, and why hadn't I done that for a degree in the first place? So I did a master's in archaeology at Glasgow. And as part of that, started looking at objects, particularly early medieval objects. There's a great lecturer there, Jeremy Hoggett and Ewan Campbell, and they really kind of encouraged that and nurtured that. And then I went on to do a PhD on early medieval objects of kind of Anglo-Saxon origin from Scotland, and I've never looked back. I just love things. I love stuff.
I mean, welcome to the podcast.
And so I've kind of worked across like the early medieval, and now I'm responsible for central and later medieval, but I also still keep my hand in with the early medieval in the job that I do now. So like all of the medieval, I love it all. It's like trying to choose between children, but actually, ultimately, if it's stuff, I'm kind of interested from any era. I just don't know a lot about the stuff that isn't medieval stuff. But yeah, I love objects and material culture and understanding them and figuring out what they mean and what they're made of and why and how and all of that stuff. I love it.
Oh, and I mean, two quick questions. So first of all, when you say early medieval, middle medieval, late medieval, speaking as a prehistorian, what does that mean?
What does that mean? What does it mean? Well, I mean, it's so I used to be kind of on the early end, so like working maybe from around 500 AD to up until so like kind of end of the late Roman period. In fact, we're working on a book at the moment that looks at that really interesting transition period, and particularly like the 5th century. So the sort of transition from late Roman into early medieval, and I used to work up to about kind of. I used to often try and avoid the Vikings just because there's so much and so many people working on that. So I used to do the bit sort of stop before the Vikings. Now I work with Martin Goldberg here, and he looks after that part of the collection. I've still got a lot of research interests there, but I pick up where he leaves off. So he looks after most of the Viking collection, and I pick up about around 1000 AD, something like that, up until about 1500 or sometimes a little bit later. And that's the central and later part that I look after now. But I work across both really. And it's one of those things where you have to choose where you break time up, like it's the same in the prehistoric period, just bigger blocks of time, right? And there are different ways of doing that depending on what you think is important, whether you think change is important or continuity is important, or whether you're being led by like historical events or just what we see in the archaeological record. So like it's sort of false divisions basically, but I work about 1000 years from about 500 to about 1500 is where I'm comfortable.
Yeah. And in terms of those divisions and things, because you are, of course, based in Scotland, I guess you do Anglo-Saxon, so UK, Scottish archaeology, but are those medieval periods? Because I know that, especially for prehistory, Neolithic in Scotland is completely different to Neolithic in, Greece or something like that most of the time. Is it the same with medieval period, or is that a little more regulated?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I definitely think it is. So, I mean, even how traditionally the medieval has been defined by way of dates compared with England is a little bit different. And when, and sort of when you see, if you break for, we have the next kind of curatorial section after us is Renaissance and early modern. So yes, it's absolutely different even within the UK and beyond. And we use different terminology sometimes in Scotland too. So I'm using early medieval here, but some people use early historic period, and other people say ultimately that there's a really long Iron Age. So we get late Iron Age being used for early medieval in Scotland too. So yeah, it's there's a lot of sort of nuance to the terminology, but yeah, broadly 500 to 1500 is the best bit.
That's an unbiased opinion and very objective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned that, so when you were a child and you would go off for your cream teas and prehistoric monuments, but then at university you went sort of more into medieval focus. And I know that we get a lot of students asking in the Archaeo Book Club and in other things that I'm part of, sort of, how do you know where to go? Like, I don't know which period to specify in. I mean, do you think that it was partly because of just having those lecturers who happened to be specialized in medieval, or was it something that really pulled you as soon as you started doing it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I guess my advice, if it was advice for somebody starting out, is just to try as many different things, places, people, periods, genres, evidence types as possible, because I absolutely, it wasn't a good fit for me to start with, but then I found what I loved. And I think it was probably, to start with, a coincidence that the people who were working on material culture that I encountered at Glasgow, they were looking at early medieval, but it was very quickly, I realised that actually particularly in Scotland, is such a vibrant, interesting time because you've got lots of different groups of people with different linguistic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different kind of artistic styles. You've got contact with Ireland, you've got contact with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms or England to the south. Is really interesting, complex. So it started off as just a kind of way in through objects, and then very quickly was like, oh no, these objects in particular are amazing. It's really complicated and hybrid, and there's so much to kind of unravel and to look at.
Yeah. Okay, well, fair enough. So try everything.
Try everything. Yeah,
perfect.
Try everything.
I like that answer. I mean, that's what I'm doing still, and really, and I'm way further than a lot of these people who are asking these questions. So it never really stops.
No, totally.
And of course, today we are on a tea break, but we are also doing some time traveling. And so I ask all my guests, and I can guess your answer based on just what we've talked about so far. But if you could travel back in time, where or when would you go and why?
Oh, this is such a hard question. And and again, like with my answer for what tea I'm drinking, I'm worried I'm either going classic or boring. I think it might be boring. So my instinct is to go back to times and places where objects that I look after now were being used, were being made, existed, so that I can figure out the things that I don't know about them, or check the things that we think we know about them, and kind of just to understand them better. So there's an example. We have a reliquary in our collection called the Monymusk reliquary, and I was doing a bit of work on it lately, and I think I can see two different phases in all of the mounts that adorn it. And this is new, like we hadn't recognized this before, but I want to go back. I really want to go back in time and be like, was I right? Was that earlier set first? Was that on that reliquary? And then did they make the other ones to match? Great. So I'd love some confirmation that we're on the right lines with some of the objects. But beyond that, I think a great spectacle, I think, would have been to see the ship burial at Sutton.
That would have been
in all its finery and all its regalia, because I know it from books, I know it from going to see the objects in the British Museum. It's amazing, but to actually see it together and to see the drama and the sort of emotion around those objects as a mass, I think that would be a great bang for your historical buck, I think, to see that in action.
Yes, no, that's a good one. We actually, we did I can't remember. I'm trying to frantically remember which episode number it is. But if anyone's interested in learning more about the Sutton Hoo burial, go back through the catalogue, because we had Natasha Bilson on to talk about that in a previous episode. So, yeah, I agree. That would also be one of the few historic spectacles that I think would be actually very cool to witness. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining me on my tea break today. And indeed, we're going to focus on an object because everyone here loves objects. So before we have a look at that, we're going to first journey back to the late 12th century, to the island of Lewis off the northwest coast of what we now call Scotland. A storm is raging outside, but inside this thick-walled rectangular building, nobody's listening to the howling wind or the distant crash of waves on the shore. Instead, all eyes are fixed on the table to the side of the roaring fire, where two figures are hunched in their seats at the long benches. The flickering flames cast tiny shadows from the small, intricately carved pieces that are being moved around on top of a large grid, which is carved into the table's surface. Some of the pieces are naturally white, some are stained red, with twisting patterns, clasping hands and wide-eyed faces. Several moves later, and suddenly one of the players lets out a shout of satisfaction. A piece is thumped down with a finality that sparks a raucous cheer from the onlookers. Backs are slapped, coins exchanged, hands shaken, and outside the storm continues to rage. So this, I admit, was just a fun little fiction. Who knows how true it is? But today we are looking at the Lewis chessmen, which I'm very excited about. And we'll get into the details of that soon. But first, let's have a very quick break. Welcome back, everybody. So something that I usually like to do before we get into sort of the details of it, or I guess to help us get into the details of different objects, is to look at the most asked questions on the internet, courtesy of Google search autofill, to see what other people are wanting to find out, which sometimes works better than others because sometimes the objects we're talking about are so unknown that there's actually no Google search. This one, there were a lot. So I had to sort of cut down and sort of summarize, I guess. And I guess in summary, there were sort of three main questions so we can sort of work through them, and maybe we'll come to some other points. And as we have Alice here today, who is currently working on a new exhibition, I believe, of the Lewis Chessmen, or a reorganisation.
New display, yeah. New display in our permanent gallery.
Yeah, of the Lewis Chessmen. She knows everything and anything there is about
steady.
Lewis Chessmen. Well, hopefully this one. First question. What are the Lewis Chessmen made from?
So most of them are made from walrus ivory, so the tusks from walruses, and that's you can see that in the different sizes of the chess pieces. There's some really big ones, and they're made from the base of the tusk, and then the smaller pieces are made from further up the tusk as it gets narrower before it comes to a point. There are also some which seem to be made from sperm whale, but there are fewer of those. So we have 2 of those amongst the 11 that are in our collection at National Museum Scotland, the rest being in the collection at the British Museum.
Okay, sperm whale as in do they have teeth, don't they? No.
Yeah.
The teeth or the bone? Or?
Yeah, the teeth, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Oh, which, can you tell if they're, because of course there's the 2 sets. Can you tell if, would one set have been carved from one tusk? Or is that 2?
So this is interesting. There's more than 2 sets. So there's at least 4 sets probably represented amongst the hoard. And we don't have all of the pieces, so we can't say definitively. But no, it's a mixture, I think, of materials for any one set. And indeed, it's not immediately apparent by eye which material is which. So I'm not a specialist, I'm not a zoologist, but a specialist can look particularly at the base and understand and identify which are which. And once you get your eye in, you can kind of see that the sperm whale ones, particularly one of them, has a bit of a grayer kind of colour than the sort of creamy colour of the walrus tusks. But yeah, it's not immediately obvious, I think.
Okay. And you mentioned colour then. So this is something that I have read somewhere. So this is why I included it in my little time travel thing. Is that correct, that some of them were stained red?
So there's a lot that's a little bit mysterious about the early part of the Lewis chess pieces' life out of the ground, if you like. Mm-hmm. So even basic things about exactly where they were found, who, by whom, all of that is very shady. And that's also true of details of the objects themselves. But there are early descriptions that describe some of them as red. Analytical work by the British Museum couldn't identify that red pigment anymore, but it's very likely that some of them were stained to differentiate them from a white set.
Like we have white and black today.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned already the hoard. So the next question actually is, how many Lewis chessmen are there? So you mentioned already there's actually not just the 2 sets.
Yeah, so it's easy because we call them Lewis chessmen, or I call them chess pieces, but we call them the Lewis chess pieces. It sort of evokes a chess set. It evokes a sort of standard number of pieces. But actually it's a hoard. It's a hoard like a hoard of Bronze Age metalwork or a hoard of medieval coins. This was a sum of resource that was buried. So there are 78 chess pieces.
Oh, wow, that many.
In total, yeah. Plus another 14 circular discs, which are probably used for either tables, a bit like backgammon, or one of the taffel games, like the Scandinavian one that I avoid saying at all costs because Neffel taffel.
Sorry to any Scandinavians listening. We apologise sincerely.
Well, yeah, it's tricky. It's a tricky one, but used for that kind of game. So we've got the chess pieces, 78 of those, 14 other gaming pieces, flat discs. Of the 78, not all of them are the figural pieces that you bring to mind when you think about the Lewis chess pieces. There are 19 plain pawns, the kings and queens and bishops and knights and warders. And there's also, actually, interestingly, as well, a buckle found with the hoard. So an ivory buckle, and that's very likely, I think, to have fastened a bag in which the other pieces were contained. Yeah.
So the hoard was literally just chess pieces, or were there other things in there as well?
As far as we know, that is what survives, and that's what was shown. The chess pieces, the other game pieces, and the buckle. But we know, as I alluded to, we know that there's a lot that we don't understand about their discovery, and we also know that the hoard had been split before it left Lewis, before it came to the attention of antiquarians when it was brought to Edinburgh in 1831. We know that some pieces had already been removed because of the way, the sort of paths into which they entered museum collections. So it seems very likely, I think, that it's gaming pieces, but we don't know that absolutely for sure.
I was going to ask, actually, because of course they're called the Lewis chessmen or the Lewis chess pieces. But I guess that gives such a bias as to what we perceive them as. I mean, was it who decided that they were chess pieces or chessmen?
It was recognised pretty early on. So, I mean, when they were exhibited, that you see them in 1831 when they were exhibited to the Society of Antiquaries, there are sort of descriptions of them as like little pygmies and people and miniature sculptures, but they're recognised early on as chess pieces because they largely replicate the pieces that we use in chess today with a few differences that we can maybe come on to later. And the sort of number of them, I think that's one of the things that makes the hoard special. When we get individual playing pieces, it's very difficult to know necessarily which game they were used for. But when you have a set, when you can see how many pieces there are in total, when you can start making sets, then you can understand the sorts of games that they were being used for. So the number of these and the range of pieces that matched our understanding of the pieces used in chess is what meant really early on it was recognized as largely as containing chess sets.
Okay. Which, and something you briefly mentioned there, leads to very nicely into the third question that came up in the auto search, which is, why are the Lewis chessmen important?
Well,
very vague, but
yeah. So I mean, take your pick, really. I think one of the things is the number of them. As I said, it's very unusual to have so many playing pieces together, and that means that we can use them to understand more about chess and the history of playing that game and other games. So there's that element. They are beautifully carved. They are just phenomenally intricately made. They're lovely. So they have a sort of intrinsic value as pieces of really highly accomplished medieval art. They also give us a wealth of information about people at the time, so the clothing and particularly the weapons give us an insight into habits and customs of the time. And then also their fine context in Lewis is really interesting, and we'll get onto that later, I think. But it's another form of evidence for a really tricky period, historically speaking, from a written source point of view. This is a tough period to work in, and objects like this give us really interesting insights into connections and cultural outlook, in this case of Lewis in the Hebrides.
Because indeed, so you mentioned cultural. So I, at some point, posted, those people listening in probably know that I used to post little reels on my Instagram about different objects. And I did one about the Lewis chessmen, 1 minute long reel. And of course, you get all these comments being like, why didn't you mention this? Or why didn't you say this? And you're like, it's 1 minute, guys. But anyway, and one of the comments that I got, which was particularly angry, was saying, why do you call them Viking Age? They are not Viking Age. And I was looking up and I was going, well, I guess the timings, maybe not, but are they Viking? And so what culture are they actually attributed to?
No, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, it's not something I would really ever get that angry about myself.
Well,
really.
You'd be surprised how many comments get very
everyone's
angry.
A critic. So over their history, people have tried to understand where they were made, and it's generally accepted that they're probably made in Norway, possibly in Trondheim, and for a number of reasons. But over their history, people have looked into maybe an English origin or continental, or maybe even a local kind of manufacturer. They're definitely what I would say Norse period. So they're probably mid to late 12th, maybe very early 13th century. And I think probably the whole Viking thing, the reason someone's objected so strongly to that is that, yeah, that's a bit later than we would tend to use the word Viking. So by that point, Viking is one of those terms where, you know, it's a term that we use to describe the past. It's not a term that was used in the way that we use it now in the past. So in that sense, it is meaningful, but it's only meaningful to a point, right?
Like Celtic, right?
Like
That's
Celtic,
problematic.
And, yeah, indeed. And so we use it to mean that period when, in particular, people came over from Scandinavia, and we associate it with raids on ecclesiastical and new dress customs and new ways of burying your dead. And it's about a sort of arriving culture doing the sort of kind of attacking and all of that.
Yeah.
Scandinavian influence then settles down and becomes a really integral part of large swathes of Scotland, and that reaches way into the Norse period and beyond. It continues today in the far north of Scotland. So that we tend to use the Viking for the early part, and then kind of Norse. I tend to use Norse medieval for that later period when the Scandinavian influence and culture is still very strong. So the pieces are probably most likely to have been made in Norway. Trondheim, we know there's walrus workshops there. There was a fragment of a very similar queen found in Trondheim, which doesn't survive. It's only known from an illustration. And there are also very similar style carvings in wooden architecture, wooden churches from Norway as well. So these are the reasons why that seems most likely. Other people have suggested Iceland might be an alternative suggestion. Certainly the Norwegians were exploiting walrus up around Greenland, and it developed into a really vibrant, really financially lucrative trade in walrus ivory back to Scandinavia, but also to Scotland and to England and other parts of Europe too. So that all fits for me as most likely a Norwegian origin. But the reason it's interesting is because at this time, the west of Scotland, Lewis, part of the Hebrides, part of hundreds of islands off the west coast, is a really kind of interesting, culturally hybrid place. Very, I guess I would probably describe it as a Gallic Scandinavian culture, quite hybrid. It's part of effectively a kingdom, a rulership that draws in the Isle of Man and that reaches right the way up through the Hebrides up to Lewis and parts of the western seaboard on the mainland too. We know that the Scandinavian influence is really strong, and we know at times Norway sought to control the parts of the kingdom. Yeah. So there's a very strong Norwegian cultural influence there alongside the kind of Irish Sea, Gaelic influence as well. So it's a really interesting point in time, and it's why it makes sense that a Norwegian origin really fits with their place in Lewis.
And in that case, is it more, because I'm thinking, because you mentioned Anglo-Saxon right at the beginning as well, and like I say, I'm prehistorian, I'm terrible at dates and remembering what happened when, because I also remember learning about the Danelaw in England, which was that whole stretch, including York and everything, which was also very Viking or Norse, depending on time period. And then Anglo-Saxons kind of came in, and then that sort of left. And so I guess they never really got up then to Scotland, like it continued for longer in Scotland, would you say then? Or
who didn't get up to Scotland? Sorry,
the Anglo-Saxon sort of influence.
Well, yeah. So in the pre-Viking period, Anglo-Saxon Northumbria reached right up to the Firth of Forth. So yeah, so southeast Scotland was part of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and that's one of the things my thesis looked at actually. And there's kind of more evidence for people trying to create an elite Anglo-Saxon identity in material terms there in southeastern Scotland than there is actually in other parts of Northumbria, the kind of bits that we traditionally think of as Anglo-Saxon. So we need to tread carefully where we are kind of crossing modern national boundaries to make sure that we're not just applying those backwards into the past, right? So that the whole England-Scotland border is irrelevant at this point. Yes, then the Danelaw, and then things get interesting, and it's more kind of a Norwegian influence in Scotland back from the sort of Viking period, back from the early attacks on the monasteries of Lindisfarne and Iona that we hear about in historical sources. And then, as I said earlier, like a kind of interaction, intermarriage, a settling, a kind of development of a hybrid culture all the way around, particularly Western Scotland, but also up into Orkney, into the Shetlands too. So yeah, different trajectories.
Yeah, so complicated. It's complicated is I guess the sort of answer for the cultural background. So going back to the Lewis chessmen. Sorry, I got distracted. So in terms of the Lewis chessmen, the idea is potentially that they originated materially in Norway and Trondheim. Is the idea then that perhaps they were kind of traded over? Would they have been brought over with someone? Would they have been actively used by people? Like, would someone have used them or played with them?
Well, so ultimately, we we don't really know. And people have suggested a couple of different theories in the past. So often it's said that they might have been brought over by a merchant, and he may have just stopped off in Lewis on his way somewhere else. Maybe that raging storm you alluded to in our opening, maybe that kept him in Lewis longer than he hoped, and maybe he was heading somewhere else and he had to kind of leave these for safekeeping. That's been quite a sort of popular theory. And it makes sense in some ways because we have multiple sets represented, right? It's not one set. Doesn't seem to be one person's single cherished set. So I can see that makes sense. I take issue, I think, with the idea that this person may have just been passing through on the way somewhere else, because Lewis it's really key. It's part of this really key Norse Gaelic culture. Lewis is absolutely the right place for these pieces to be being given, maybe or in the process of being given, or intended to be given as kind of diplomatic gifts, if you like, or potentially to be brought by a trader or potentially even somebody from the church. We needn't see these as sort of accidentally in Lewis, I think is what I'm getting to, or accidentally in the Hebrides. If they were brought as part of a kind of trade attempt gone wrong, but just because the guy didn't come and get them again, then that fits. It fits with our understanding of the connections between this part of the world.
And I talked actually with, I guess, one of your colleagues, Adrian Maldonado, in a previous episode about the Galway hoard and the idea of a hoard and the whole concept of that, which, again, long story short, it's complicated. So you have this hoard of chess pieces. Do you have other similar hoards? Like, is there any idea? I guess you mentioned that it's sort of difficult to know exactly about the excavation of these objects and how they were originally in place. But is there anything known about what potentially they were deposited for, or why they might have been deposited?
Not really. And it's a bit frustrating. It's because of the sort of mists that shroud their original discovery. So even the sort of close find spot is a little bit unclear. There's a couple of different places suggested. And so we've lost that, as with so many antiquarian finds, right? We've lost that immediate archaeological context. We know that they were found in Lewis. We know that they were found together. We know that they were found with this buckle. We know that there are very likely to be pieces missing. Beyond that, we're into speculation, which is fine, insofar as we can based on what we know. There's no comparable hoard from the UK of playing pieces like this from this period. So particularly from Scotland, the other playing pieces that we have are single finds by and large, some antiquarian finds, some from excavations. We have many playing boards, also from excavations. So by looking at other assemblages and other sites, we can understand more about who might be playing these sorts of games and why and when. But yes, the chess pieces, there's so much that we don't know, just because of the kind of mists that surround their discovery and the hands that they pass through in order to arrive in Edinburgh.
Yeah, so you mentioned you can at least say a little bit about who would have been playing these kinds of games. So I mean, chess, for example, like, was it a common game? Would everyone have played it? Would it have just been elite? Or I guess if they're so beautifully carved, I can't imagine just a sort of simple farmer going, oh yes, I'm going to have a game of chess with my fancy carved chess pieces now.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. So, I mean, we see these today, the Lewis chess pieces, as really quite elite objects. They are beautifully carved. And so I think these are objects that would have been intended for an elite audience, for kings or their important people. And there's a sense then that chess in particular is more, in that social milieu, is more than just a game. It's a way of playing, and it's a way of socializing and kind of strengthening those bonds between a group of people. But it's also an opportunity to learn tactical thinking, strategic thinking, and also to demonstrate that tactical thinking amongst your peers and potentially amongst people who are visiting you, but maybe not necessarily your kind of immediate friendly group, you know.
So other kind of like, I'm smarter than you. I can beat you in a fight if you need me to. Exactly.
Okay. So there are later sources. Some of the sagas have descriptions of people playing chess and the kinds of pickles that people get into, the sort of social etiquette of not wanting to refuse an invitation to play, but not wanting to beat your host, and what do you do? And the game goes on for
when
days.
You're that good at chess. Oh,
but that,
I know that feeling. Oh man, yeah.
And then it also gets tied up with like kind of morality as well, because to begin with, the church wasn't super happy about people playing games, particularly games of chance. But there's definitely a point when chess becomes a bit more acceptable, and you see it being used actually as a sort of teaching method, and it definitely sort of transitions into something that's a bit more acceptable because it's recognized more as a game of skill than as a game of chance. So there's definitely a sense that chess sits really well in that elite martial society, that these Lewis chess pieces clearly were intended to, because they are so beautifully carved. We also have simpler chess pieces. There's an example from Coldingham in southeastern Scotland. It's not a figural piece, it's a sort of geometric piece, but we know it's a chess piece. Whether or not that's intended for somebody kind of less elite than these pieces is a bit of a moot point, really, because the earlier traditions of chess piece design weren't figural. So they weren't as elaborate. They weren't as detailed. They weren't depictions of people. And so it may just be that this piece is drawing on that tradition. So we have to be a bit careful about making, as we always do, we have to be a bit careful about making assumptions based on, kind of how fancy things are, if you like, because there are other things at play here. But we also have maybe not. So I said the thing about the Lewis pieces is unusual is because the volume of them, we know that we can demonstrate that they are chess pieces, and there are these other tables pieces or these drafts-like pieces in that hoard. We have lots of those. And so there are individual finds of that kind of disc, some very elaborately carved. There's one carved with a mermaid. There's one carved with a really cute little rabbit. There are others that are very plain, some with just sort of ring and dot decoration. And those give us a sense that probably those kinds of board games, if you like, were being played more widely. The number of gaming boards, sort of checkerboards that we have scratched onto stone and recovered from excavation assemblages suggests that board games were being played more widely. But when we get these individual pieces, it's difficult to know whether it's tables, like this sort of backgammon-like game, or one of the Taffel games, which are different again because they involve one side with fewer pieces and the other opponent has double the number of pieces, and you're like uneven forces. Exactly. So when you only have one piece, it's difficult to know which game's being used, but there is a sense that games more broadly are being played more widely.
Yeah. And like you say, I guess there's sort of different variations. So would it have necessarily been the chess that we know today, or would it likely have been?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I'm not a chess expert. I do play a little bit, but
I mean, you said at the beginning of this podcast that you're not an expert on the Lewis chessmen, but you've been able to answer every single question very detailed.
No. I can play chess, but my 11-year-old son routinely beats me. So
well, he is a master, so it's fact.
So as far as we understand, the origins of chess probably lie in around the 6th century, probably in India. Possibly in other parts of the world too, but clearly in India, where it then spreads to Persia, and then it spreads throughout the Islamic world and gains rapid popularity from around the 9th century across medieval Europe. And we have Arabic sources, written sources about rules of chess, so that the Islamic sources. And we can see a transition that I alluded to a minute ago from different shapes of chess pieces. So, for instance, in the Lewis chess pieces, what we might call the rook or the warder, which today is the castle piece. It's usually in the shape of a castle. The rook or the warder are foot soldiers in the Lewis chess pieces, including some that bite their shields. Those are the ones that have been identified as the berserkers. But the word rook comes from a word for chariot. So originally that piece would have looked very different. The other pieces originally were elephants, because they reflected the different elements of, effectively, I suppose, Indian army. And elephants were an important part of that. So you can see the form and the identity of the pieces changing, even if their names haven't. So Ruk comes from Ruk. It still comes from the Persian Arabic word for chariot. So there are continuities as well as some changes in the form of the pieces. And it seems like there is a development in the rules as well. I think there's quite a lot of sources, as far as I understand, that complain about how long chess takes. Like, it just goes on for ages, right?
I mean, when I play, it seems to be over very quickly.
I know, me too. But maybe people were better at it. I don't know.
Here.
Yeah. So there were sort of ways suggested to speed up the game, and some of those included, as we do today, allowing a pawn to jump 2 spaces from their first move rather than one, and a rule change to allow the queen, to move multiple spaces rather than one. So I think it would be recognizable as chess, but potentially slightly different rules, and yes, slightly different pieces. But most of the pieces are those pieces that we play with today. So we have the kings, we have the queens, we have knights, and we have bishops.
Okay. Well, then I think I'll not challenge the, Jarl of Lewis to the chess match.
Me neither.
Just because of that, I don't want to embarrass myself with not knowing the rules, Okay. Well, we're going to have another very quick break now so that those listening can have an opportunity to top up their tea, although it's probably gone cold. It was so fascinating. I forgot to drink my tea during that time. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that the teacups are now fuller and the biscuit jar is emptier. So we did already introduce sort of your background a little bit in the first section of the episode in terms of your sort of area of interest and topic and everything. But I find it really fascinating. We've talked so much in this podcast about how the problems of kind of working out where objects came from and what their history is and how to interpret them and all that kind of thing. And yes, you were also interested in objects, and you are specifically a senior curator with National Museum Scotland. So perhaps we could go into a bit detail. How does that work in terms of your everyday work day? I guess let's start from the beginning. What road led you to that position in particular? Because, from research.
Yeah, well, so, I mentioned earlier I did a PhD at Glasgow working with Anglo-Saxon material culture from Scotland. And that led me to spend quite a lot of time working with National Museum Scotland's collection, because we hold the majority of the material that I was interested in, not all of it, but the majority of the material that I was working in. So that gave me a really great introduction to the department here, to the staff here, to the collection, to understanding its history and how that affects how you have to go about researching it as a researcher today. And it kind of, it got me a foot in the door, I suppose. So that was the starting point. Then I managed to get possibly the best job title I will ever have in my life. If you like whiskey, you will have heard of a whiskey called Glenmorangie. Glenmorangie redesigned their bottles, and they used a design from an amazing and iconic piece of sculpture from Hilton of Cabol in Northeast Scotland, that was found very near their distillery. They use that as their brand logo. They call it the signet. It's a spiral-based pattern, so it's triskells, but arranged into a sort of panel in which there's a kind of hidden cross, because the Hilton of Cabol monument is an early Christian cross slab. So they were inspired by this, and they came to the museum to talk to them about it. And my incredibly enlightened first boss, keeper of archaeology at the time, David Clark, realized that there was an opportunity to work with them and develop a research project to find out more about the period that produced this logo for them. And so he managed to negotiate a 3-year research project with a full-time academic researcher called the Glenmorangie research officer, and I got that job. I think, because I already had material culture expertise. I already had specific experience of working with the collection here, and my PhD was on a sort of an aligned topic. And so that was amazing. It was a great opportunity, brilliant time, 3 years. It was so successful, and we did so well, and they loved it so much that they renewed. So I had another 3 years. Lovely. And we wrote a book, Early Medieval Scotland, which is designed for interested people, maybe people just starting out at university, wanting a kind of material culture focused way into the period. It's called Early Medieval Scotland, Individuals, Communities and Ideas. And so it's not kind of chronological, it's not historical. It takes objects first and then looks at the stories about individual people or communities or bigger ideas that we can tell through them. So we, as part of a team, we co-wrote that and published that, and it was really great. We did lots of fun things in that project. They renewed it again. So I had, albeit...
Work with whiskey distilleries is what I'm hearing.
I know. It was amazing. 9 years worth of that research post, effectively, based here. We did another book called Scotland's Early Silver that looked at the first 1,000 years of silver from its introduction in the Roman period, right way through to the start of the Viking Age. We did an exhibition on that, and that was an amazing highlight to do. And then they renewed for another 3 years, but my colleague, who you alluded to, Adrian Maldonado, excellent colleague, he took over the Glenmorangie reins at that point, and I got a permanent job here looking after the later section of the collection we spoke about earlier, so the Central and Later Medieval collection. So then I have kept one foot in the early medieval whilst working on the late medieval too. So yeah, it's been a maybe slightly unusual trajectory. I started, I loved it. I just realized that this was actually absolutely, I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to be anywhere else. I want to do this stuff here. I was very lucky.
Yeah. And so that was sort of purely research focused. You mentioned that you did some exhibitions as well. So was the exhibition sort of curation tied up with the research, or were they kind of separate?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, no, it was. So all of the 9 years as the research post, I wasn't curatorially responsible for things, but I researched them. So research is a really big part of a curator's job, and it's a really big part of my job now. So I did that part of curation, and we worked on a special exhibition, together as well, and actually another temporary display of craft recreations that we made of things that don't survive or don't survive very well. We worked with craft makers today to understand why they might have been made and how they might have been made. So we had a display of those recreated objects as well. So I got to do the research side and the exhibition side and the publication side of being a curator. I also got to do an awful lot of speaking to the public. I did a lot of public talks and lectures, all with an eye partly to help raise the profile of the research project and to credit our sponsors. So it was very public facing. So I did a lot of what a curator post involves during those 9 years. But the shift now into full-time curator means that I get to do a little bit less of the public facing stuff. I still get to do it, and I'm looking forward to doing a talk later this month, but it's not as a huge a part of what I do now. There's a lot more other things. So I'm responsible for acquiring objects, for selecting objects to acquire, whether that's excavation assemblages or single chance finds that have gone through our treasure system, as well as registration and collections care and research and exhibitions, and responsible for the permanent galleries where our objects feature as well. So one of the things I'm doing at the moment, as we alluded to earlier, is updating the permanent display of our 11 Lewis chest pieces in our Kingdom of the Scots gallery at the moment, which is super fun.
And you say redesigning. Is it fancy new? Is it a virtual storm that you're walking into?
Well, no, it's not. But in the future, so our galleries opened in 1998, so they've been open quite a while now. And when we do come to relook at the whole of the space, we will be looking at really fun, interactive and innovative ways to engage people with the collection. At the moment, it's more tweaking, but we're moving them into a nice prominent space. But the most exciting thing is that at the moment they were adjacent to another case, so you couldn't walk around a case, and there was a backboard in the case that gave you some interesting information, but it meant you couldn't see the backs of the pieces properly. And the thing about the Lewis chest pieces is we all know them, or if you know them for their faces. Their faces are amazing, but the backs are stupendous. The thrones that the pieces sit in are all intricate, elaborately carved, all different. They're amazing. So the best thing about this is that we're moving them so that you'll be able to get a proper 360 view in the round for the first time. It's very exciting.
Very, very cool. And hopefully, I think by the time this releases, it'll have been opened, I think.
Yes,
so
that's right.
Hopefully we'll have some pictures as well to show, or indeed, go visit. Yes. That's a better thing to do, indeed. But no, that's really fascinating. And as we've talked about, I sort of joked last time, but it's true, you've managed to talk about the Lewis chessmen as if you've been researching them your whole career. But as you just mentioned, you haven't been. Is it something, do you know now a lot about lots of things? Do you have to sort of get very good at quickly researching the most essentials of different things? How does that work?
Yeah, so you do. It's a bit of both. So there are things that we individually are researching and generating novel information on at the moment, and me and my colleagues all do that all of the time. But we have to be quite selective, right? We all curate thousands of objects, so we can't do that for everything. We have to choose our moments, and sometimes that's based on clear need. If there's things that we just can see are dying, calling out for work, or it might be generated by the need to update a display, or it might be generated through other reasons. Things, if objects are maybe degrading, we might try and look at a generating research project to try and understand why, and that sort of thing with our colleagues in conservation. So there are lots of different reasons why we might start doing research on any one part of the collection. So at the moment, I'm bringing a book to fruition on silver, and that's the kind of academic end of that Glenmorangie First 1,000 Years of Silver. But it's the really difficult 150 years, the transition between late Roman into early medieval bit. We're sort of bringing that to fruition at the moment. But at other times, we need to just be able to communicate and tell people about a huge amount of the collection. So yes, it's understanding what has been done before, looking critically at it, assembling it quickly, and then being able to talk about it in an enthusiastic way. Much as I would love to give all of my collection some novel research time, we have to be quite selective. But I've got things on the go on late medieval seal matrices that I'm getting really excited about at the moment. Mm-hmm. There's always a potential to do new projects, even on some of our really iconic objects. So things like the Monymusk reliquary that I spoke about at the beginning, or the Hunterston brooch, which is an amazing early medieval brooch. It's the largest one in our collection. These are really iconic objects that, for some reason, sometimes slip through the cracks. I think people assume that they're iconic and we know everything about them, but actually you often find that nobody has looked at them. Yeah. Nobody's looked at them closely.
Even if you've looked at them like the Lewis chessmen, we still don't really know anything about them.
Yeah, there's always new things to be done. So, yeah.
Ah, great. Well, okay, we've mentioned the research part, the curation part. However, I also saw, when I had a brief look at your bio, that you're also the Grants and Awards Officer for the Society for Medieval Archaeology and part of 2 supervisory teams for the AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Awards. So how does that work compared to your work as a curator?
So I think the work of a curator is really interesting because it's so diverse and there are so many different facets. And obviously the collection is at the core, but we also have a role and a responsibility to advocate for our period, for our discipline, and to support other people doing that. And so both of those things that you alluded to are roles where I'm trying to support other people's development. So I've done the Grants and Awards Officer for Medieval Archaeology for a few years now, and it means that I get to assess all the grant applications that come in. I get to find other people on the council to do that with me. I also get to read submitted undergraduate and postgraduate theses in order to choose prize winners. The Society for Medieval Archaeology has prizes for both of those types of dissertations. And that's a really rewarding thing to do, to feel like you're kind of giving something back a bit more generally to the people who are working or aspiring to work on this period. So that's great. And the HRC Collaborative Doctoral Awards, well, we co-supervise PhD students in the museum with universities. So I have a student who is just doing their corrections, actually, having passed at the University of York, thank you, and another one who's imminently about to submit at the University of Durham. And this scheme has been amazing because it's, so I came in, as I said, to the museum as a PhD researcher, and I was working on my own project. This allows us to help generate the projects that students come in to work on. So we don't just facilitate access to the collection, we help identify, working with the universities, where the research gaps are, whether it's thematic or whether it's materially focused. So the project that's just going to come to an end later this year is on medieval dress accessories, and I developed that with the university because I could see there's a huge need as part of my day job, looking after the collection and growing the collection, to understand this group of material better. I could see there was a massive gap in research. So they are, in a way, like extra things that we do, but in many ways they are integral to doing the rest of our job well, I think.
Yeah, which I think is the case with so many different things, right? You always find that link, and there's a reason why you do all the different things. Is there's usually some link to something you like. So
exactly.
Yeah. Well, final question that I always ask is, if you could sort of go back to your younger self and say, give some advice that you wish you'd known then, or, if you would give a piece of advice to someone else, like a doctoral student or anyone who wants to kind of follow a similar path or get into a similar field, what advice would that be?
Well, I think when it comes to working with museums, I think trying to make those connections, come in and use the collection, spend some time with curators, understanding not just the objects that you're looking at, but kind of the history of the collection as well, because every museum collection has a different past and requires different skills to navigate it. And once you start developing those skills, yes, about objects sort of generally, but then also specifically about a museum's own collection and past, you suddenly become really useful to the institution. So you make those connections, spend time getting to know the collection and the history, and really don't be afraid to show your enthusiasm actually for the collection. So if you're applying for jobs in this kind of sector, there's lots of people who might have relevant kind of period experience, or have a PhD on a topic or that's relevant. But if you can show engagement and enthusiasm for the material culture specifically, and even better, that institution's material culture and collection, that's really, really important, and it goes a long way to kind of making the connections that you need to kind of get started in this kind of job.
Oh, good advice. Also drink whiskey, I think, is what we've discovered. Yeah.
Responsibly.
Yeah,
Responsibly.
Of course. Savor the whiskey.
Yeah, savor the whiskey.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your insight and information. That marks the end of our tea break. It sounds like you've got a lot to do, so I should let you go back to work. But thank you so much for joining me. It was really great to hear everything and get so many insights.
That was wonderful. Thanks very much for having me, Matilda.
Yeah, no worries. And if anyone wants to find out more about Alice's work, the National Museum of Scotland, the Lewis Chessmen, check the show notes on the podcast homepage. I'll put as many links as possible in there. I hope that you all enjoyed our journey today. If, as always, you want to help support this show and all of the other amazing series that form the Archaeology Podcast Network, you can follow, like, subscribe, etc. Leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Or if you want to help us more in a financial sense, you can also become a member, which will help us create even more amazing free to listen to content. You also have exclusive access to ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So for more information on that, check out the homepage at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. I hope that you enjoyed our journey today. If you did, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Tea Break Time Travel.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.